Well, welcome to this year's Ethel M. Wood lecture. It's great to see you. My name is Paul Joyce. I'm the Samuel Davidson Professor of Old Testament Hebrew Bible here at King's College London. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all. The Ethel M. Wood lecture is a University of London event, an annual lecture endowed by Mrs. Ethel M. Wood in 1947. And now administered by the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at King's. Since the foundation of the lectures in 1947, many distinguished speakers have lectured on topics within the broad field of biblical studies. They include H. Rowley, Kathleen Kenyon, James Barr, Morna Hooker, E.P. Sanders, and C.S. Lewis. And a very happy and fitting addition to that list is tonight's distinguished speaker, Professor Konrad Schmid. Konrad Schmid is Professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the University of Zurich. Before he was there, from 1999 to 2002, he was Professor at Heidelberg. He's associated with both the Institute for Advanced Study and the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton, and has been a fellow of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. From 2019 to 2022, he served as president of the International Organization for the Study of the Old Testament. His many publications include Genesis and the Moses Story, Israel's Dual Origins in the Hebrew Bible, 2010, The Old Testament, A Literary History, 2012, Is There Theology in the Hebrew Bible, 2015, and A Historical Theology of the Hebrew Bible, 2019. Those are just 4 examples from a very long list of books, which to my mind combine focused, detailed expertise with a great gift for communication and writing. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Konrad, to give this lecture. And Konrad is now going to speak to us on the theme, Thinking About Thinking, Modes and Developments of Second-Order Thinking in Ancient Israel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for having me here. It's a great pleasure and privilege and honor for me to deliver this Ethel M. Wood lecture today and being able to speak to you. The Hebrew Bible is an ancient text, reaching back as a written text to the first millennium BCE. Some of its oral precursors may date back even to the second millennium BCE. Within historical anthropology, there is a certain tacit assumption that the basic structures of the human mind of ancient people are not so different from those of the mind of the modern people. Some even claim they are basically identical. Or, in other terms, when addressing the basic questions of human thinking, self-consciousness and intellectuality, there is no need not to read Gilgamesh, Isaiah, Plato, or Cicero, just because they are ancient works of ancient authors. Thinkers back then or now don't necessarily have better answers to, for instance, Kant's 4 classic questions just because they lived in a specific era of human history. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? What is a human being? One feature of human thinking that, at least in its basic contours, is probably as old as thinking itself, is the attempt to think about thinking. Some philosophers of science, like Yehuda Elkanah, identify this process as second-order thinking. The term second-order thinking originally stems from the field of economics, denoting the will and the capacity not only to develop plans by myself, but also to anticipate the reaction of others and integrate them into my decisions. The distinction between first and second order thinking then had been taken up by philosophers like Elkanah, who employed the notion of second order thinking in relation to the rise of geometry or philosophy, in his case in ancient Greece. No doubt, this rise is a major achievement and step forward within human intellectual history. Nevertheless, I would prefer to understand what Elkanah calls second-order thinking in broader terms. True, it makes sense to identify something like science in the ancient world, but it is, of course, not a clearly defined or even institutionalized segment within ancient intellectual or religious history. The idea of the birth of second order thinking with the awakening of what later became philosophy or mathematics is a concept ex post that does not necessarily help to understand and reconstruct the intellectual endeavors of ancient humans appropriately. It is therefore probably misleading to use the expression second order thinking or thinking about thinking just in the singular. I'd prefer to speak about second order thinkings in the plural, or about different modes and stages of thinking about thinking. In order to identify manifestations of second order thinkings in the Hebrew Bible, I'd like to offer the following working definition. Second order thinking or thinkings, of course, in various degrees, can be found in intellectual processes that include an act of synthesizing previous material. Metabasis eis allogenos, not necessarily in the specific terms of genre, but possibly also just in terms of different intellectual levels. A significant amount of innovation related to pre-existing knowledge, and a certain act of demystification and rationalization. Of course, these are soft criteria, and not necessarily all of them are always met in processes of second order thinkings, which denote a spectrum and not a unique step. But I nevertheless hope to offer some basic thoughts that can prepare the field for further inquiries and refinements regarding second order thinkings in the Hebrew Bible. A specific interest thereby is to bypass the widespread Orientalism, in the sense of Edward Said, in ancient studies that often does not even look beyond the Greeks when asking about the origins of second order thinkings. A certain step in that direction was taken with this volume that traces the notion of laws of nature beyond the Greek world to ancient Israel and Mesopotamia. In what follows, I would like to discuss some examples from the Hebrew Bible of second order thinkings, and I'd like to evaluate them in the terms of these four categories or elements that I mentioned. I would like to stress that this is work in progress, and as a disclaimer, be prepared that I will be more interested in learning from your reactions in the discussion after my talk than that I would like to adamantly defend my own positions. Or put in other words, I invite you to think with me about thinking about thinking. But beforehand, some disclaimers are in order. It is possible that my topic could cause you some discomfort in several respects. Therefore, I would like to avoid some possible misunderstandings by presenting a few prolegomena. First, in previous scholarship, my topic has often been linked to the controversial discussion of an axial age. Yehuda Elkanah's seminal article on the emergence of second order thinking in ancient Greece was even published in a volume dealing with the topic of an axial age. Second order thinking, that is thinking about thinking, has often been seen as a product of cultural revolutions that can supposedly be observed between 800 BCE and 200 BCE in such different places like ancient China, India, Persia, Mesopotamia, Israel, and Greece. The notion of an axial age has been predominantly connected to names like Karl Jaspers and Shmuel Eisenstadt, but as Jan Assmann has shown, it actually goes back to the period of Enlightenment, to scholars like Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil Duperron, who was the first person to translate the Avesta into a European language, in his case into French, Jean-Pierre Abel Rémusat, and others. Today, I think it's fair to say that the axial age, as a modern German science magazine has it, is an invention. The theory of an axial age can be the object of a historical study, but the axial age itself is a failed historical claim. Historians are usually and rightfully so reluctant to define a period of global awakening of the human mind across cultures, and indeed closer looks at the intellectual developments from China via India and Israel to Greece probably show more peculiarities than communalities. So please don't expect any attempts for a revival of an axial age from my talk. Secondly, my topic seems to tie in with another bygone discussion of the 20th century, the question about a particular Hebrew thinking or Hebrew thought. It had been brought up foremost by Thorleif Bowman in the early 50s and became a salient topic in biblical studies for quite some time until James Barr killed it in the early 60s with his seminal book about biblical semantics. Indeed, Thorleif Bowman's approach was more a specimen of Western Orientalism than a sustainable theory. James Barr and others correctly pointed out that there is neither a Hebrew nor a Greek, not even a Norwegian thinking that would be so dependent upon a specific language that it rightfully would deserve to be called after that language. The discussion has been recently taken up by Jan Dietrich, a colleague from the University of Bonn in Germany, in, at least in my view, a helpful way. At least we need to move away from postulating a linear link between thinking and language. We need to get away from simplistic binary oppositions like Thorleif Bowman's comparison between Hebrew and Greek thinking, and we need to reconceptualize and differentiate the observations by Thorleif Bowman's and others in a tradition historical way. I'm using the term tradition history in a way how my doctor father Odil Hannes Steck shaped it. Tradition historical inquiries try to elucidate the tacit assumptions that influence a text's specific formulations. Tradition historical givens can pertain to specific worldviews, specific broader convictions, specific individual notions and ideas, or just specific terms that come with certain associations. Thirdly, In the current discussion in the humanities, particularly in historically oriented disciplines, there is a certain reluctance to use concepts like development or second order, because scholars fear that these might be perceived as supersessionist concepts. Whatever lies before the emergence of something new runs the danger of being seen as of minor value or underdeveloped, and second order thinking seems to be a term that denigrates any first order thinking, if there is any such thing. I will I will neither try to develop any linear evolutionary schemes nor to advocate for a Western or Eurocentric angle for classifying different orders of thinking. Nevertheless, I will neither shy away, if necessary, from identifying developments and or new levels of thinking should I be prompted by textual evidence to do so. Here is there is a certain developmentophobia in the humanities that, on the one hand, is certain that is on the one hand is certainly helpful in a post-Hegelian context, but on the other hand, should also not cloud the analysis of certain processes that we can, based on according evidence, identify in the material we deal with. Let me now proceed to matters of content. I'll begin with a very simple but nevertheless important example from Leviticus 11, a text that belongs to the broader realm of priestly literature in the Pentateuch. Regarding the purity of animals, Leviticus 11:3 is relatively brief. Any animal that has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed and chews the cud, such you may eat. Then some exceptions are being discussed. Some of them are zoologically more accurate than others, but there is no list provided of animals. Just the criteria are being given: divided hoofs and chews the cud. Leviticus 11 has, as is well known, a direct parallel in Deuteronomy 14, which is, however, significantly longer. It first presents a list of clean animals, followed then by the same criteria, formulated very similarly to Leviticus 11:3. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep, and any animal that divides the hoof and has the hoof cleft in two and chews the cud among the animals you may eat. It is not really important whether one considers Deuteronomy 14:6 as an addition in Deuteronomy 14, taken over from Leviticus 11:3, or if one considers Deuteronomy 14:4-6 as an integral text that then was reduced in the reception by Leviticus 11:3, just to mentioning the two criteria. At any rate, it is conspicuous that in Leviticus 11:3, just naming the criteria suffices in order to explain what a clean animal is. This is an act of thinking about thinking that either was already prepared by Deuteronomy 14:6, evaluating the list in the preceding two verses, or introduced by Leviticus 11:3 in the first place. Leviticus 11 in all probability, I misrepresented this in the image. Leviticus 11 in all probability postdates Deuteronomy 14. So please exchange the two. It seems like there is a development here that can be observed by jettisoning the list of the specific animals in Leviticus 11. The categories seem to suffice. Let us quickly consider our 4 criteria mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Second order thinking can be found in intellectual processes that include the following 4 points. Criterion 1 is certainly met, but it is important to stress that already the list as such is also the result of a synthesis. We know from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt the phenomenon of Listenwissenschaft. Even if items are just enumerated on a list, the list assembles these items implicitly or explicitly into a specific category. The list is also the product of a second order thinking, but reducing it to criteria is an elevated specimen of second order thinking. The metabasis eis allogenos is clearly visible here. The pure animals are included in a new class that was not defined beforehand, but is the result of specific intellectual efforts. Therefore, also the criterion of innovation is being met. And finally, it is also fair to identify a certain amount of demystification and rationalization. Purity of animals is a concept that can be understood, and it is based on rational principles. It's not just a random identification, at least according to Leviticus 11. A second example stems also from the priestly literature, and it is about categorizing as well. This time not about animals, but about the nature of the divine. It is already evident from the famous passage in Exodus 6, 2-3, that P, the priestly code, obviously is trying to categorize the manifestation of God in a systematic way. Usually, Exodus 6:3 is translated as a sentence with 2 subjects, my name and Adonai. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Adonai I did not make myself known to them. It could also be interpreted, as probably also the Masoretes did, by putting Itzakef Katon above Adonai in the following more drastic way. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but my name is Adonai, period. I did not make myself known to them. Be this as it may, P here tries apparently to come to terms with the tradition that the divine name is not so deeply anchored in the ancestors' story in Genesis as it is in the Exodus story. Therefore, P develops this theory of a staggered divine revelation from El Shaddai in the period of the ancestors to Adonai in the time of Moses. But this is only a minor element in P's endeavor to think about the nature of the divine. The most revolutionary act in this regard is P's use of Elohim, that is programmatically introduced by P in Genesis 1. Elohim is a Hebrew noun which can either mean God or gods. Elohim without the article would therefore be translated as a god or gods. However, neither of these translations is adequate for P, as is immediately evident from Genesis 1:1. In this verse, Elohim can neither be translated as a god or as gods, but it obviously just means God. In Genesis 1 and elsewhere in the priestly code, Elohim is always construed with singular predicates. While this is all very well known, it is still necessary to stress the grammatical peculiarity of the priestly code's use of Elohim in Genesis 1. If Elohim does not mean a god or gods, but God capitalized, then Elohim is used here like a determined noun, although Elohim is morphologically undetermined. The determination of Elohim in Genesis 1 is not established by an article. Elohim seems here to be sufficiently determined by itself. This means, and this is the crucial point, that the priestly code uses Elohim like a proper noun, because only proper nouns are nouns that are sufficiently determined by themselves to obviate the need for an article. The reason why a proper noun, at least normally, cannot be combined with an article lies in the elementary fact that proper nouns by definition refer to entities which only exists in the quantity one. The specific use of Elohim as a proper noun in the priestly code has been noted several times in biblical scholarship, also making its way into the dictionaries, although with different emphases. Obviously, this priestly notion of Elohim is particularly interesting for our question regarding second-order thinkings in the Hebrew Bible. Apparently, by using Elohim as a proper noun, P identifies the category Elohim, meaning the class of gods with its sole representative, Elohim, God. If the only God coincides with the category of gods, then it is a logical consequence that all other gods are included in the notion of God capitalized. Others may venerate him under different names, but actually it's just God with a capital G. It is, however, doubtful whether the priestly code historically can be seen as the inventor of this usage of Elohim as a proper noun. If so, all instances of determined Elohim without an article in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible needed to be classified as either priestly or post-priestly texts. For a large number of instances, this is indeed probable, especially the Elohistic Psalms in Psalm 24 to 83 or in the book of Jonah. On the other hand, there are quite a few statements where Elohim is used in a determined way without an article in Judges, Samuel, and Kings. It would be, of course, just a circular argument to classify these verses as post-priestly. Nevertheless, I think it's still fair to maintain that P played a major role in, if not inventing, then at least consolidating the programmatic second-order usage of Elohim as integrating the class of divine beings into the concept of an inclusive monotheism. Again, let us have a quick look at our 4 criteria for second-order thinkings. The first 3 points are immediately evident for the priestly usage of Elohim. It synthesizes pre-existing notions of the divine into a unified concept of inclusive monotheism. It identifies the category of deities with its soul element in it, and it inaugurates or at least enforces the employ of Elohim as a proper name. Most significant with this 4th example is, however, the 4th criterion. The priestly use of Elohim represents indeed what Yehuda Elkanah addresses as a transcendental breakthrough. Elohim is identified as a purely divine entity and the world as a purely mundane entity. For P, God is not a volatile and arbitrary agent in a supernatural sphere, but a transcendent actor who imposes his outspoken and rational plan onto the world and implements it in it. Of course, there are also ancient Near Eastern texts that develop a unified understanding of the divine, such as the famous Babylonian Great God List, An Anum, from the second half of the 2nd millennium. Here, several deities are identified as specific functions of Anu. There are similar lists also for other deities of the Babylonian pantheon. The idea here is that major gods can include other gods within themselves. These other deities are just alternative names for different modes of action that actually go back to one supreme deity and are thus ultimately manifestations of that deity. The biblical usage of Elohim, however, still is different from these lists because, firstly, it introduces a monistic concept of the divine, and secondly, because it shapes and introduces a new terminology. Looking back at the two examples so far, the clean animals and the concept of the divine, I dare to say that it is no coincidence that both of them stem from the priestly literature. P is an exception within biblical literature. In my view, and I am aware of all the shortcomings of this term, P is the first representative of a rewritten Bible within the Bible. Of course, there was not yet a Bible in the first millennium BCE, and therefore also the term rewritten Bible is an anachronism. But for the sake of making my point clearly, please allow me for a minute to use this term. What I would like to highlight here is the fact that embarking on the enterprise of second order thinking often brings the necessity with it to produce secondary literature. Why did P not just originate as another fortribun in the Pentateuch? Apparently, because its intellectual decisions and reinterpretations of already existing material were so different from that tradition that a new text had to be written, and therefore P originated as a source text, a standalone literary unit. Prophetic books include collections of prophetic oracles. It's a long-standing result of scholarship that these collections are not randomly organized, but in various thematic ways. The most obvious ordering principles can be found in Isaiah 1 to 39, in Ezekiel, and in the Hebrew Vorlage of the Greek version of Jeremiah, and in Zephaniah, where oracles against Israel or Judah are followed by oracles against the nations, and salvation oracles for Israel or Judah conclude the book. Even these collections, in all probability, are already an expression of second order thinking, even more so because this sequence is probably meant to describe the overall course of history. First, there is the judgment against Israel, then the judgment against the nation, and the aim, the target of history is salvation for Israel. But there are also intellectually more specific ways of dealing with given oracles that apparently triggered the need for certain syntheses beyond merely collecting similar material, which could be interpreted as an even more qualified second order approach to reading and organizing existing oracles. I'll just discuss one example from the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 33, 14 to 16, there is an oracle that is very similar to Jeremiah 23, 5 to 6. Both are promising a righteous branch for David for the near future. Of the 42 words in Jeremiah 33, 14 to 16, 22 are found in Jeremiah 23, 5 to 6 in exactly the same order. However, despite the verbal and thematic similarities, 33, 14 to 16 is anything but a mere doublet to Jeremiah 23, 5 to 6. Instead, 23, 5 to 6 is reinterpreted in 33, 14 to 16, which the differences between the two texts clearly demonstrate. That Jeremiah 33, 14, 16 is taking up Jeremiah 23 and not the other way around will become immediately clear in a minute from their contents, but it is also evident from the textual attestation. Jeremiah 33:14 to 16 is lacking in the Septuagint and belongs to the empty pluses of Jeremiah, and therefore Jeremiah 33:14 to 16 is likely to be quite a late addition to the book. The opening formulation in 33:14 follows 23:5 very closely for the first 6 words, but then 33:14 is linking the coming days not to the raising up a branch for David directly, as in 23:5, but first to the fulfilling of the good word that God spoke to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Only then, in those days and at that time, God will raise up the branch for David. Jeremiah 33 differs from 23 in that the announcement is not just about one thing that is about to happen in Jeremiah 33. First, God will fulfill his good word, and only then, in a second step, he will raise up a branch of righteousness for David. But what is this good word? Apparently, Jeremiah 33:14 is not just vaguely referring to some unspecific good word or promise. Instead, given the determination in the expression, et hadavar hatov, a specific promise seems to be meant. There is only one other instance in the book of Jeremiah where hadavar hatov appears, and this is in 29:10. God's good word refers here to the bringing back of the deported ones, the diaspora. If we read Jeremiah 33:14 to 16 in light of this sufficiently clear reference back to Jeremiah 29:10, then Jeremiah 33 says nothing else than that the diaspora must return to the land of Israel before the Davidic kingship will be restored. This seems quite logical. First, the nation needs to be reunited in its own land, and only then the re-establishment of the Davidic dynasty is possible and necessary. Otherwise, these kings would have nothing to rule over. What is happening here? Given the lack of Jeremiah 33:14 to 16 in the Septuagint, we can be quite sure that this is a text that is centuries away from the historical Jeremiah. Jeremiah 23:5 to 6, on the other hand, might very well go back either into the time of Jeremiah himself or the generation thereafter. For readers of the book of Jeremiah, say in the 4th or 3rd century BC, it was incomprehensible why the promise of Jeremiah 23, a new branch for David, went still unfulfilled. Therefore, they looked for a solution in their tradition, and they found Jeremiah 29:10. There are different promises for Israel's future, not only the restoration of the Davidic dynasty, but also the return of the diaspora. Therefore, the authors of Jeremiah 33:14 to 16 combined these two promises, and at the same time, they were capable to formulate an explanation why the restoration of the Davidic dynasty was so terribly delayed. Again, how does this example resonate with our 4 criteria? Jeremiah 33 is evidently a synthesizing prophecy, bringing together formerly independent passages from Jeremiah 23 and 29 and formulating a new concept. Although Jeremiah 33 looks quite like Jeremiah 23, it's a substantially new edition of a prophetic oracle. It explicitly combines 2 prophecies into one. So innovation, both in terms of genre and matter of content, are a given here. This is even more true for the aspects of demystification and rationalization. Prophecy, according to Jeremiah 33, is not just the process of conveying more or less clear or unclear divine messages to a human auditory. Rather, prophecy also includes reflection and combination of traditional oracles that have been there for decades or centuries and demand for clarification. If they have not been fulfilled so far, they are not simply mistaken, but they need further rethinking. The logical combination of the return of the diaspora and the re-establishment of the Davidic dynasty afterwards is a scholarly product of thinking about thinking. It demystifies and rationalizes prophecy from just being a Neum Adonai to transforming these divine utterances into insights into a plane of a divinely guided history. Of course, these samples from Leviticus 11, Genesis 1, and Jeremiah 33 for thinking about thinking or second order thinkings are quite diverse. But this lies in the nature of the subject. Second order thinking is as diverse as thinking itself. Nevertheless, these texts share the attempt to take one step back from pre-existing thoughts, traditions, or texts, and to make sense of their complexity on a new level of thinking. They are a product of thinking about thinking. They synthesize and systematize given knowledge and take it one step further. Is it possible to interpret these samples in the wider context of ancient Israel's intellectual history? Let me try to formulate some very brief concluding remarks in 4 short points. Firstly, the emergence of a scribal culture in ancient Israel was an important catalyzer for the development of meta reflection. Thinking about thinking is as old as mankind, but not all thinking is thinking about thinking. If we look at the very beginnings of the cultural history of ancient Israel, and by this I mean the transition from Israel's prehistory to Israel's history that is marked by the rise of literacy and the scribal culture, then I assume it is fair to say that the emergence of the first texts in ancient Israel already is, albeit in a quite modest way, an expression of thinking about thinking. Presumably, most of the texts that ended up in the Hebrew Bible were based on pre-existing oral traditions that now were being put in writing. This is true for some early Psalms, for narratives like the Jacob cycle or the Exodus story, and for some notable parts of the traditional legal material or wisdom sayings. Writing them down is already a significant act of interpretation that includes a variety of conscious or unconscious choices. Secondly, the experience of the loss of state, temple, and kingship, first in 722 for Israel and then in 587 for Judah, had a major influence on the way these ancient cultures reflected on their pre-existing traditions. This is particularly evident in the case of P. Against the traditional history of scholarship, which identified P as a mere epigone to J and E, P is probably one of the biggest innovators in religious and political thinking in the Hebrew Bible. I think it is fair to say that P and its cognate literature in the Hebrew Bible is coming closest to what one could identify as a literary specimen of second order thinking. P, in all probability, is the first example of secondary literature and thus also innovative in terms of genre. But first and foremost, P proposes both for the big questions, like the unity of the divine, and also for the small questions, like classifying the clean and unclean animals, new categories of thinking. Besides P, one could also name Deutero-Isaiah or Chronicles as literary expressions of second-order thinking. Deutero-Isaiah is forcefully evaluating Israel's intellectual heritage and rejects the Exodus tradition and formulates the idea of a new Exodus that will replace the former one. The chronicler's history retells the nationalistic Deuteronomistic history in a theocratic and Judah-centered perspective, getting rid of the Exodus and introducing the era of the temple founders David and Solomon as Israel's new origin tradition. Thirdly, the fall of Samaria and the fall of Jerusalem triggered not only intensified reflections regarding Israel's own traditions, but also the genesis of, in ancient Mediterranean terms, of course, worldwide diaspora, increasing the cross-cultural contacts of Israelite and Judean scribes massively. The pluralization of the international knowledge systems had a major impact on efforts of second-order thinkings. How to bring Babylonian and Israelite cosmology together? How to align mythical traditions from Mesopotamia and from Judah? As we can see from the Hebrew Bible, the integration and alignment of foreign knowledge with local traditions was a major enterprise. This can be observed particularly in the realm of the primeval history, but also in some liturgical material, like, for example, Psalm 29 or 93 in the wisdom tradition or in the legal materials. It goes without saying that these cross-cultural encounters and challenges were promoters of second-order thinkings. Generally speaking, it is interesting to see that developments of second-order thinkings seem to be rather products of crises than of prosperity. Fourthly, the encounter with Hellenism and the now much more intense globalization of the ancient world in the aftermath of Alexander the Great provided groundbreaking new challenges to the intellectual tradition within Second Temple Judaism. At the same time, it is probably fair to say that the era of Hellenism was one of great disorientation and insecurity after the 2-century-long Persian period that was shaped by a certain global stability, except for some insurrections in Egypt. This insecurity in the Hellenistic period triggered new efforts to deal with prophetic expectations, for example, within the tradition. In Jeremiah 33, we have a case where we can grasp the clear intention to bring together material that has been formerly unrelated. On the one hand, in order to explain the problem of the delay of the restoration of the Davidic dynasty, but on the other hand, just to solve the problem of how different prophecies might relate one to another in terms of content. Is there a discernible development of second-order thinkings, in the plural, in ancient Israel? It's probably too early to tell, and we should not expect linear, but rather multifaceted developments. But it is my impression that following the lead of P, starting in the late 6th century BC, such endeavors became more and more common, particularly in broader literary terms. But the chronological developments are probably less interesting than the different conceptual modes in which meta-thinking, thinking about thinking, second-order thinking is taking shape, and I hope I have been able to provide a glimpse into that with my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Konrad. Fascinating. So we have now some opportunity for question and discussion. And I'm looking for hands, and Konrad's indicated he's happy to respond. Please, yes, Jess at the back. Thank you.
Thank you for such an incredibly stimulating but I don't think it's just very late in the day and I'm struggling and my brain's in general. What's the difference between second order thinking of the examples you gave specifically, and the exegesis? So, we might have in the past said, well, Chronicles is reinterpreted.
Right.
Sorry.
No. This is actually one of the crucial and really central points. What categories do we use in order to identify specimens of second order thinking? And I was struggling with finding an adequate terminology. And on the one hand, of course, you could say if you have a very watered down concept of second order thinking, every example, say in the Bible of in a biblical exegesis of foretrial, would qualify as an example of second order thinking. And I tried to mention this in the very last section of my talk. I think to a certain degree this is even true and correct. Even somehow the putting in writing of formerly oral material, organizing it in a specific way. Say, for example, in the book of Hosea or Amos, where you have clear structures for formerly individual, independent oracles. This is already an expression of second order thinking. But I think it's still qualitatively quite different from the examples that I have been showing. So, for example, peace concept somehow of the unity of the divine. This is also an example of second order thinking, but it's on a different level. So therefore I try to somehow emphasize the term second order thinking in the plural. Second order thinking denotes a spectrum that begins with very modest specimens, like putting in writing oral or formerly oral material, or very modest examples of exegesis or inner biblical exegesis, but they can extend to much more sophisticated approaches, like, for example, in Chronicles, retelling the whole Deuteronomistic history under a new concept, or in peace, somehow really taking a new approach to Israel's founding tradition. And in my mind, P even was the first author in the Hebrew Bible to combine the Genesis and the Exodus materials, and therefore really constructing actually a new myth of origin for ancient Israel.
Thank you. Please, yes. Is it, identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Neil.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. That's really interesting. So the animal list in Leviticus 11, it seems like it satisfies the three of the criteria, but the fourth one about rationalization.
Yeah.
I think that doesn't seem to fit, because if it was a rationalization, the criteria would explain why they are unclean. Whereas just at the moment it's just synthesis.
Yeah.
And I guess taking that, maybe we could use that as a way of differentiating different types of
Right.
Do you get one?
Yeah.
So like some of them seem to be concerned with rationalization, and some not.
Yeah, maybe somehow we hear different overtones with the term of rationalization. I think on the one hand, I agree, and you are correct. Of course, no rationale is being given. But nevertheless, I would insist on a certain aspect of rationalization. If you just say a pure animal, a clean animal, has divided hoofs and choose the cut. This is a rational criterion. It's not just somehow enumerating animal A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on are pure. Because if you just have the list, you could add animal H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P. But if you have the criteria, then it's clear. It's zoologically clear, although the Hebrew Bible, as we know, made some mistakes. So some of the animals look like they are chewing the cud, but they are not really doing. But nevertheless, they are subject to that criterion. But I agree, somehow it would be, of course, nicer if somehow Leviticus 11 would elaborate more on that. But on the other hand, I also try to say this, the list itself also, of course, has a certain amount of, or conveys a certain amount of rationalization. And here again, like with the exegesis question, I would say giving the criteria is just, it takes it to another level.
Joan Taylor.
That's really interesting what you're saying. I just have a question, sort of fundamental question about the categories of your thinking. We know the Western tradition is rather bound up with the idea of great ideas of great men, and men think individually and create change by their thinking. I'm wondering how much your thinking about second order thinking is accommodating more of a collective in terms of how ancient Israel might do that thinking, not only within scribal culture, but within the community that is telling the story.
Yeah, I think, of course, unfortunately, we do not know as much as we would like to know about the scribal circles that were responsible for producing the texts. Maybe they were not too big, but I think one thing is clear, that it probably was a collaborative enterprise. We do not know these persons by name. In traditional scholarship in the 1950s and 60s, there were some attempts to identify who J was, Abiathar, in the Solomonic court, but this was, of course, pure speculations. Yeah, maybe I think this is a good and important point, that these different modes of second order thinkings really need to be connected to sociological realities that might have been quite different from ours, sitting men on chairs and writing down important thoughts.
Thank you. I see some hands over here. Can I pass the microphone to the back? So I think I saw you first, please. Yeah. Could you give us your name, please?
Yes. Yanjing Otara. I'm from Cambridge University, PhD student. So I wonder, your notion of secondary thinking is more or less influenced by the Western Enlightenment model of reasoning. Do you see second order thinking that actually mystify or make things more vague? Like as in the big portion of the wisdom literature, which is rather dated rather late, and it doesn't really fit into the direction of rationalization. And so I wonder, second order thinking is, in this particular form, or is a hardcore science that second order thinking has to be in this way?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So first, for somehow the Western nutshells that somehow play a role here in identifying second order thinking. So this was one of my interests, really, to broaden the scope, to broaden the perspective, and claiming that second order thinking is not just something that is connected to the Greco-Roman ancient world, which is usually somehow the case. Yeah, I saw there are two Greek statues here at the entrance of King's College. We don't have a statue of Gilgamesh here. The same is the case with my home university. We have a replica of the frieze of the Parthenon in Athens in our courtyard, and we don't have an Assyriology and an Egyptology. And I was actually trying to say that second order thinking is not only discernible in cultures that eventually produced something like science or philosophy that then became successful in the Western world, but that we also have elements and specimens, samples of second order thinkings. In this case, in the Hebrew Bible, and of course also in Mesopotamia and other ancient cultures. Regarding your point, I think that's very interesting. Can processes of second order thinkings also add layers of uncertainty, of unclarity to given experiences and traditions? And I would say clearly, yes. I had a section that I had to leave out due to time constraints on Proverbs 10, 1-5. And in Proverbs 10, 1-5, I think one can show this is a sequence of probably formerly independent wisdom sayings. They are arranged in a very logical way, but somehow this arrangement of Proverbs 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this results in what I would call, with Benno Landsberger, a stereometric reading. So taken for itself, every single one of these sayings is clear for itself. But once they are put in a sequence, their content somehow comes into a balance with the content of the other sayings. And the reader really somehow has to construct the meaning, the interpretation of these texts in a third dimension above the textual surface. And here I would say, on the one hand, this of course blurs the meaning of every single individual saying. It's about who is a wise son, who is a stupid son, how is it with wealth and richness and so on. But the overall ensemble actually shows this question: who is actually a wise son, and what helps somehow to increase wealth, and what aspects of wealth are problematic. This shows that there was an awareness. If we take this to a second order thinking level, then we cannot pinpoint the meaning of the overall sequence. So therefore, this would be one example, and I think there are probably many others. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, my name is Anthony. My question is related to hers. I was wondering, second order thinking, is it necessarily progressive, or can it be cyclical? That's the first. Is it necessarily positive? And I'm thinking of early wisdom tradition that seem to give the impression that the just is rewarded and the wicked is punished. And then you have the kind of the another tradition that gives indication of cynicism. Cynicism pays. So this second order thinking, is it necessarily positive? That's the first. And then what's the function of second order thinking?
Yes. I think, first of all, I would probably refrain from attaching labels like positive or negative to emergencies or processes of development of second order thinking. I think probably this is true for all intellectual efforts or endeavors of humans, that they can somehow yield positive or negative consequences. Maybe, yeah. So, for example, the older wisdom tradition was certainly being taken up in the Deuteronomistic thinking, and the Deuteronomistic thinking, maybe to a certain extent, somehow put this in too harsh a theory, and maybe therefore, if you would like, you could say, yeah, maybe the wisdom tradition beforehand was more fluid, but of course it's also to a certain extent a matter of a gusto. Then your second point is it somehow cyclic or so? I think probably the main element is about human thinking. A thought, once thought, is in the world and can no longer be removed from it. So I think it's more this additive element that probably plays a role and is of importance here.
Thank you. I think I saw other hands there. Yes, Ken Dark, please. You could pass the microphone on.
Thanks. I just wondered, that was a brilliant talk, but there's a conceptual question I was wondering if you could answer. If there's such a diversity of second order thinking, as you elegantly explain, and if some of that second order thinking in effect builds on other second order thinking, as you also explained, is the concept of second order thinking in need of revision, in your opinion? In other words, should we have a third and fourth order thinking or something like that?
Yeah. I would be more than happy if I would have a good answer to this. I think this is really, it was the very first question, and you really can ask with full right, is this overall category of second order thinking, as I now somehow used it, is it not lumping together two diverse things? And should we somehow introduce other categories like third order, fourth order, and so on? And I'm a bit hesitant somehow to look into that direction. I think you mentioned that C.S. Lewis was one of the Ethel Wood lecturer, and I think he was the one with the two cultures. And I think in the 21st century, probably something like third order thinking in bringing together the two cultures, so the humanities and the sciences, this would be something where I would say it's appropriate. I think probably for my further engagement with this topic, I probably would rather look and try to closer describe these examples of second order thinking, and then somehow ask myself afterwards, does it really make sense to somehow still adhere to that category of second order thinking, or should we rather speak about modes of interpretation of activities of the human mind and so on? On the other hand, somehow it's these four criteria, they lend hand to a certain identification of what one might be able to subsume under that term.
Thank you. I wonder if I might ask a question. I mean, would you or would you not regard as relevant to this discussion? Thank you. Would you regard as relevant to this discussion or not, perhaps, the sort of historical self-consciousness that one gets in a place like 1 Samuel 9:9, formerly in Israel, what one now calls a prophet, one formerly called a seer.
Yeah.
Historical self-consciousness.
Right.
Is that relevant or not?
Yeah. Certainly, I think this is an excellent example. So it's one of these classic examples for a gloss, for an interpretation, something which is no longer understandable. So because an old term is being used, so a new term is being introduced. So certainly, and even if you take it somehow to this level of historical consciousness, this was what people named it beforehand. But nowadays it's different. If you somehow push it to this sphere of historical self-consciousness, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you. Please, two hands here. So we come to Meg, please. Dr. Megan Warner.
Thank you, Konrad. I'm trying to edge my way to a question, and it has to do with your brief comment about second order thinking that is designed to create uncertainty rather than to offer answers. And so I'm thinking about stories designed to pose questions which aren't necessarily answered. So ethical conundrums in Genesis, for example, or stories like Genesis 22 or 2 Samuel 24 or perhaps Job, which raised huge questions about the justice of God, for example.
Yes, I think these are indeed very good examples. I just, when you started to talk, I was thinking also of other examples in the biblical literature. So, for example, there are 2 books in the Hebrew Bible that end with questions. So, Lamentations 5 ends with the questions, and Jonah 4 also ends with a question. And of course, this is, yeah. But I think, on the other hand, again, this is again dependent on what kind of expectations we have towards the identification of second-order thinking. So, for example, writing down something like a primeval history and creating a literary world out of its own, somehow, creating a past in your own mind. This is also quite an intellectual adventure. Of course, we also have some kind of interpretation that is going on, because, of course, there, as Israel Finkelstein usually famously says, there was no office in the Second Temple to invent stories. So everything actually is taking up given traditions. So I think the narrative material is, of course, already also relevant in that respect, and also the legal material that somehow tries to find out or define rules for social and political life, for example.
Thank you. I should remember the microphone. Is it David Friedman?
Yes.
Friedman. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konrad. That was super interesting. If, say, an example of first order thought is listing things you shouldn't do, you shouldn't eat this animal, that animal, the other thing. And then second order thought is, here is a rule from which you can derive examples. Third order might be, here is a way of generating rules. And then you could keep going up, right? Just, I don't know that that would be relevant here. But so there's a difference between deciding what you should eat and then how you ought to behave, having a rule for how you ought to behave with abstract concepts. I mean, that can be extremely complicated, as we all know, right? So I wonder, so there's, I guess, I don't know if I have a question there, but I'll pose it as a question. Are there examples, would you see, are all ethical rules, well, don't kill, that's pretty straightforward, unless, of course, you have a question of self-defense, or be just. So is there a hierarchy depending upon how abstract the terms are in the rule? That's one question. The second is sort of more pedestrian in the text, and that is Deuteronomy 14 versus Leviticus 11. Of course, Deuteronomy 14 says, here's a list, and also don't do this. And then it says, by the way, just to clarify, if there's a cloven hoof, but not this, or if they chew cud, but there isn't a cloven hoof, and Leviticus has everything except the list in the beginning.
Exactly.
Is it because the rule that's already in Deuteronomy 14 covers all of the animals in the list, or is it because some of the animals in the list, Leviticus 11, doesn't actually know what they are? Some of it probably it does, like Ezim and whatever, but some of them maybe he doesn't. So he's got to do something. So he simply says, well, maybe we'll just leave off that list.
Maybe it's easier for me to start right with your second point. Of course, this is, so to speak, the spectrum, the panorama of possible explanation. I tried to mention it. The identical criteria that are being given in Deuteronomy 14:6. It can be that someone who produced Leviticus 11:3 just inserted the same criteria as an addition to the list in Deuteronomy 14:5, or the criteriology was already present in Deuteronomy 14:6, and Leviticus 11 actually thought that's enough. I don't need the list, But of course, you could also say, Deuteronomy somehow wanted to elaborate on this. I think it's we cannot know for sure, but I think for me, the speaking thing or evidence is simply that Leviticus 11:3 is happy just with the criteria.
So was Leviticus 11 being what's the right word? I mean, it seems like either Deuteronomy 14 is being redundant. Just even it doesn't matter in which order.
Right.
If the rule doesn't cover all the animals in the list, then you could say you needed to have some of the animals in the list. Or if the rule does cover them all, you could say, oh, that was redundant. Why did he list them? Maybe for rhetorical force. But he had the rule, so maybe he wasn't unfamiliar with the idea of rules. And then with specific subcases, which you get in, hooves and not whatever, which you get in both places. I mean, one can never know this.
Right.
But then that would push against the idea that somehow Leviticus 11 is a significant development in terms of the structure of the thought.
Right. I think it depends on how you interpret it, and even more so if people really are convinced that also the Listenwissenschaft is already an expression of second order thought. Regarding your first point, I think you mentioned my booklet that I published in 2015. Is there theology in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible? So my answer there was it depends on what you conceive of as theology, but I think it's quite clear in the Hebrew Bible we have ethical texts, but we don't have a theory of ethic. We have texts that somehow are about human knowledge, about human perception, but it doesn't somehow include a theory of human perception. So therefore, I would say probably, just given the history of reception of Greek philosophy, somehow, to a certain extent, indeed, somehow the Greek tradition became more influential for the Western system of the academy, of how to organize the way of inquiring into things, but nevertheless somehow we have this way of stepping back, of trying to evaluate given knowledge also in the Hebrew Bible. But I think this theoretical aspect is something that we probably cannot find in the Hebrew Bible.
Thank you. Yes. So if I could come to Catherine and then to Elizabeth, please. And then we'll probably be heading towards a close. But so if you have a further question, maybe snappy. But Catherine and then Elizabeth.
I'm not sure whether this is a question, and I'm not sure whether it's a legitimate question. So I'm
Let's try.
A bit brave. Okay. So when you were talking about sort of Greek and Roman modes of thinking sort of dominating the way that we've progressed, if you like, I found it very interesting that the people who were doing second order thinking, the Hebrew second order thinking, didn't jettison their religion. So they were rationalizing their religion. Whereas I sort of feel like the Greek philosophers kind of threw it out, Is there any kind of, interest in that? Is that a kind of legitimate distinction or not?
That's difficult for me to say, and I probably also would be trespassing into the field of the classicists, but I think maybe it's a fair view to say that for the Greek religion, the realm of the divine was somewhat more remote. It somehow was removed to the mythical past, and maybe also the rise of democracy, this experience of a post and non-monarchic organization of the society also gave opportunities to the rise of a more rationalized thinking. But I think also there in the Hebrew Bible we have parallels. So if I was advocating for P as one of the major exponents of second order thinkings in the plural in the Hebrew Bible, I think it's no wonder that, or not too astonishing that these texts are also post-monarchic in in origin. And I think, as many people somehow have described P, we have also this aspect of rationalization and of somehow demystification of the world in P that is also a religious revolution. So in P, for example, to say the heaven is no longer the dwelling realm of heavenly beings, but it's just an architectural construction that somehow keeps the water from above from falling down. So maybe one could also see there processes of criticism of religion within the realm of the Hebrew Bible.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll come for a last question to Elizabeth Sauerfeld.
Thank you.
I was hoping that you could perhaps elaborate on something that you just sort of mentioned towards the end, which was that second order thinking is something that is resorted to in times of crisis.
Yes.
And I'm particularly interested just because it reminds me of what I've been specializing in, that people resort to divination or build.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is for me. This is not a very distant thought to say, if historical experiences challenge your previous traditional assumptions, if you are confronted with things you never expected to happen, then you can either give up or you can try to rethink what had been shaping your thinking beforehand. And therefore, I think it's really, it's the big crisis that move the intellectual histories forward. So, for example, I think it's probably fair to say, for the religious history of ancient Israel, probably the two destructions of the temple in 587 and 70 CE were the most effective catalyzers for religious innovation, for development, for triggering new thoughts. So I think it's probably something that is not only true for the ancient world, but also for many instances in modern history.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to say a word of thanks. We've earlier on, I mentioned the list of those who've given this lecture, and it is indeed a very fitting thing that you should be added to this list because you've given us a bold and exploratory presentation with the indication that you were keen to hear from us all, and then to lead us in a joint exploration of that on top of a superb paper is splendid. And I want to thank you also for doing this at the end of a long day, which you began. So you've topped and tailed a long day, and we're most grateful to you, Konrad. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to you and